Good morning, everybody. Hope you are well. Thank you for joining us. Wow, is it just me or is everybody's video off this morning? Oh, there we go. Thank you, Jeff Klein. You win the award. But that means everybody's still in pajamas, enjoying their coffee. Who knows? Oh, now here come videos. Okay, there you go. Thank you for joining us. It's good to see you. You do not have to turn your video on, though. We love seeing your face and seeing where you are. So it's great to have you. I'm not going to say any more except that for those of you who joined us last week, I think we all really loved learning about the beautiful north of Israel and learning about each other's faiths. And so I think Asaf has a wonderful tour in store for us this morning of Jerusalem. So Asaf, take it away. Good to see you.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi. And it's great to see all of you here this morning. And I love seeing the cameras. So if you're up for leaving those on, please do. It makes it feel more like a tour, less like I'm talking to a bunch of black screens. So it's really, really a pleasure to see you. And today we're actually headed to Jerusalem. And a little disclaimer before we head to Jerusalem. Today I had a really, really hard time trying to come up with the sites we're going to be visiting. On a Jewish trip, on a Christian trip, we typically spend 3 days in Jerusalem. I had to narrow down to 50 minutes because I know the friends from the church will have to go, it's 10 to. So my apologies if I'm not covering everything, if we're not seeing everything you've had in mind. I really tried to give you a taste of everything. So let's start off where we were last week, right? What did we learn last week? We introduced the concept of the big question. Remember, I told you I read the Gospels. I look at this time period where the big question in the back of everyone's mind is, how do I live as a Jew in a world which the public Jewish identity of that world is constantly being eroded away? And therefore, we started to learn and to look at scripture from this angle because this is what was bothering the ordinary person living 2,000 years ago, including the Jewish population, including Jesus and his followers, which were all Jews. We spoke about the Galilee, and today we're heading to Jerusalem. Now, as we head to Jerusalem, we have already what we've learned last session in the back of our minds. I want to introduce the city, and I want to say what to me is the most fascinating piece about Jerusalem. Over here, standing on top of the Mount of Olives, within the reach of a finger, we can touch the most sacred sites to Jews, Christians, and Muslim within literally a touch of a finger or within a walk of, let's say, 40 minutes. Let's try and introduce some of those sites just for beginning. Where you look at this Golden Dome was not there 3,000 years ago. The historical name of this mountain is Mount Moriah. And according to Judeo-Christian tradition, this is where Abraham is about to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Roughly 1,200 years after that event, this is where King Solomon will build the first temple because of the historical tradition of this mountain. This is where the second temple would be built as well, which is critical for a Christian perspective, because when we think of the second temple, this is the temple that Jesus walked around. Now, this is only this Golden Dome over here from a Judeo-Christian perspective. But if you look at the two gray domes over here, do you see them now in the center of the screen? According to most Christian denominations, you're now looking at the most sacred site on this planet. This site, according to most Christian denominations, not all, I know, most, is the site where the three most significant events in Christian history took place. This is the site where Jesus was crucified. This is the site where Jesus was buried. And this is the site where Jesus was resurrected. The name of the site is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, finally, let's go back to our Golden Dome. And I know we were already there before, but there is also a Muslim twist on that very site. If you've been in our tour with Jaffa, I know only a handful of you were. So we spoke about how Jewish and Christian traditions find their way into the Quran, but we don't share the same text. Jews and Christians share the same text, the Old Testament. Muslims share similar stories, not the same text. Now, according to Muslim tradition, this dome is called El Aqsa. And according to Muslim tradition, in the 7th century, Muhammad travels to a place called El Aqsa, which translates in Arabic to the edge of what was perhaps the known world to the people living in the Arab Peninsula. Over here, from this rock, underneath the Golden Dome, he ascends on a magical ladder. As he climbs up in the magical ladder, and this is in the Quran, he encounters previous prophets. He encounters Jesus, he encounters Moses, he encounters Abraham, the same ones which are sacred for our tradition as well, until he reaches God himself, Allah. And the conversation that happens there is a very Middle Eastern conversation. God tells Muhammad, tell your people to pray 50 times a day. Muhammad doesn't argue, climbs down the ladder, and when he sees Moses waiting there, what does he say? What does he say, guys? Holy Moses. No, he doesn't say that, but he sees Moses, and Moses asks him, what did the guy tell you? And he's like, he told my people to pray 50 times a day. Moses, I imagine, that's not in the Quran, puts his hand on his shoulder and he says, look, buddy, this is the Middle East. You never take your first offer. Over here, you bargain. Go back up there and reason with him. It's unreasonable 50 times a day. And then he adds, my people can't even do 3. Climbs back up there. God tells Muhammad not 50 times a day, 5 times a day. Climbs down underneath to the same rock. Muhammad, Moses, Jesus, and Abraham all pray together over here in the site where the El Aqsa Mosque would be built later. So to make things a little more confusing, the same place, which is Mount Moriah, the same place of the first and second temple, is also the 3rd most sacred site in Islam after Mecca and Medina, the Dome of the Rock. Why is it called the Dome of the Rock? Because underneath it is the rock where Muhammad ascended to the heavens from. This is something you can't do anywhere else in the world. Now, let's orientate ourselves a little bit as to what it is we're seeing now. We're standing now on the top of the Mount of Olives. And if we entered this at the era of the Second Temple, one sec, allow me to share my screen with you because I want to show you something pretty cool. All right, so if we would be standing at the exact same viewpoint 2,000 years ago, this is what we would see. Instead of the Golden Dome, specifically on the same place, you would see the temple. And there's no question that as you're looking at this, as a Jew, 2,000 years ago, your mind is blown. This is like the Empire State Building to the ordinary Jew living here. He had never seen something in this scale. I'll tell you something about Roman sources that describe this land from the time of Jesus. They say this land is famous for 3 things. Number 1, the Dead Sea where everything floats. Number 2, the day of the Sabbath where no one works. To you living in a community right by a Jewish community, it sounds natural. You know that Jews don't work on the Sabbath. But in the Roman world, that was unheard of. So this was the second miracle. And the third miracle, as described in Roman sources in this part of the world, is the temple in Jerusalem. That is perhaps one of the largest praying plazas in the Roman world, size of 14 American football fields, that does not have a single statue in it. This is a wow factor for people of the ancient world. Over here, you have the Kidron Valley. All right, if we turn over here to our right, do you see the vegetation? This is Gethsemane, and we're now standing on the top of the Mount of Olives. All right, so you can look back to the Mount of Olives. Let's go back to the year 2021, where we were standing at the moment. And one thing I want to point out over here is you see the tombstones, right? Those tombstones are some of, this site is the oldest cemetery in the world, which is still active. Not just a Jewish cemetery, any cemetery, all right? We have here tombs which are over 2,700 years old, all right? That means that when Jesus entered Jerusalem, he saw some of those tombs. I don't know if this one to the right or this one to the left, but tombs were here 2,700 years ago. And if you're asking yourselves, why were people buried here 2,700 years ago? Well, if you open the book of Zechariah, and remember that the Jewish community at the time of Jesus, at the Second Temple, was a text-bound society. Scrolls were very expensive, and therefore the typical method was to memorize text. It was not uncommon in a yeshiva that someone would come in and he would want to go to a yeshiva and study by a wise rabbi. He would ask him, quote for me the entire book of Ezekiel, or quote for me the entire book of Isaiah. So the reason that in this site serves as a burial site, because in the book of Zechariah, it is described that the Messiah will enter Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. And as he does, he will resurrect the dead. When Jesus enters Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, he does it because he is familiar with the text, as a wise Jew would have been at that time. Of course, coming to Jerusalem, entering on a white donkey, is fulfilling another Jewish prophecy. The Messiah will come to Jerusalem riding on a white donkey. And therefore, you see those links in the Judeo-Christian history that sometimes we tend to miss. The reason Jesus enters from here is because he's a Jew and he's familiar with Jewish prophecies, with Jewish texts. If you wonder where Gethsemane is today, if it's a site I can still point to, take a look over here. Over here, do you see those two gray domes? This is the Church of Gethsemane. It's going to be part of our tour. Now, today I will open for questions, but a little less than last time because I have a very, very ambitious schedule for you. So from here, we're going to jump straight ahead to this side over here. And the first thing that you should ask me is, Saf, what are we looking at? We definitely see here a big wall. We see that this is the corner over here. Let's try and better understand. So in order to allow you to better understand, what I need to do is I need to take you to the same view of 2,000 years ago, and I need to share with you the same perspective. First of all, when you look at this map, can you all see the Temple Mount complex? This is the temple that was built by King Herod. All right, it's the second temple. He didn't really build it. There was a temple here before, but in terms of architecture, he is the one that made it what it is. He built here the largest praying plaza in the Roman world. He changes topography to do it because Mount Moriah naturally is small. But where we're currently standing over here is parallel to the western retaining wall of the temple. Right? It's not the wall of the temple. The wall of the temple, you can all agree with me, is up on top of the platform. This is the western retaining wall of the temple. If you've been to Israel, if you've heard of the Western Wall, yes, we're referring to the same wall. Where people pray today is just further over here behind this platform. Right? If you want to ask me later, why not pray here? What makes that part more sacred than others? I'll answer you later, but there's no spiritual reasoning behind it, only practicality. Practicality is important for worship, right? You can ask your clergy, both rabbis or the pastor, they will tell you that practicality is critical. All right, so now the question is, why did they bring you over here? Let's try and enter the Jewish experience of 2,000 years ago, right? Jews live in small rural communities for the most part. Let's say like Nazareth or like Capernaum, where we were last week. And let's say in a community with the average size of 300, 400 people, the largest event you've ever seen in your life is, let's say, a big wedding, right? With like 200 people. And you as a child are growing up with this feeling of anticipation. Everyone around you are talking about the temple in Jerusalem, this magnificent building that you've never seen anything like it, right? This is the buildup that the ordinary Jew has coming to Jerusalem, friends. What you're looking at over here in the ancient world could be compared to someone from a small village in Ethiopia landing in Times Square, New York. This is the experience that Jesus is going through, Jews in the group. This is the experience your ancestors are going through, right? They're coming from your small village and they see this. Like in Times Square, New York, what happens? You're arriving here and you look up to the top of the skyscrapers, right? This is a skyscraper in the ancient world. The glass building material that is not typical that you see in New York, right? This could be compared to those limestones that are perfectly cut like nowhere else. This building was aimed to create a wow effect, and for sure it did. But the thing is, this is all material goods, right? There's no spirit in it. There's no heart in it. I don't think I used the term last week, but to me, when I read the teachings of Jesus, I see it as Jesus was trying to create a restoration movement to Judaism. He's saying Judaism has become perhaps too commercialized, being led by those clergy all the way up in the temple. And we need to restore Judaism to its roots. Put yourself in the shoes of Jesus, a Jew who's very much connected to the Jewish teachings, arriving in Jerusalem expecting a spiritual journey to connect to his creator. And he's arriving over here at the very, very bustling street, the Wall Street of Jerusalem. And what does he see here in those ancient shops? You see here merchants, and he sees here people who are selling doves and people who are trying to pickpocket, try and feel like the contrast of what he was expecting and the commercial activity that he finds here. Doesn't matter if you're a Jew or a Christian. I think that's a feeling we can all relate to, a feeling of disappointment. And if you open Matthew chapter 21, read this, and all of a sudden it will make sense. Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all the people who were selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it into a den of robbers. Right? This is what he would go through. I would argue, maybe in this shop, those are original shops from 2,000 years ago where people sold merchandise needed for the worship in the temple. Right? So this is it. Now, when he does that, I want you to think of another thing. Remember how last week we talked about the geographical element of Capernaum being in the zone of two separate tetrarchies? It's like in the no man's land. It's an ideal place to start a new large political movement because it's far away from the center. What is Jesus doing here? He is coming here to Jerusalem, the center of power, right underneath the noses of the Roman army, the noses of the clergy, the ones who are running the temple. And over here, he's not only talking about a restoration movement, he is trying to do here a social revolution. And we can understand why the clergy of Jerusalem and the Romans see this as a potential threat. But it doesn't end over here. Stick with me for this part because it will make much more sense. Do you see those piles of stones? Those piles of stones have, I think, a spiritual meaning for both the Jews over here and the Christians in this crowd, and I'll explain why. If you've ever been to a Jewish wedding, you know that we break a glass. And what do we say when we break the glass? If I shall forget you, O Jerusalem, let my tongue stick to the edge of my mouth if I will not praise Jerusalem on the peak of my joy. Right? Why do we do this? Because we have a historical memory of what it meant for the temple to be lost, to be destroyed. It doesn't only symbolize the end of the temple, it symbolizes the end of Jewish sovereignty in this land. That's why we remember it not only by the wedding, it was one example. But for the Christians standing here, I want to ask you the following thing. Those stones, when you look at them, they're not part of the retaining wall. Can we agree on that? Because the retaining wall is still standing. So then we need to ask ourselves, well, where did these stones come from? And then in order to help us out, I'm going to take us to what we can see from 2,000 years ago. The pile of stones you see is roughly where my mouse is. So it's not where the arch. Therefore, when I have to look what structure up on top could those stones be from, I think that a good gamble are the stones of the temple. So for the Jews in this group, when you're coming to the Western Wall to mourn the temple, maybe we're actually far better off touching those stones over here because there is a far higher chance those are the stones of the temple than the Western Wall stones, because remember, they're retaining walls. But to the Christians in this group, and again, I love this jumping back and forth, you're now touching a prophecy that was given by Jesus. Right? Like, where else can you do this? And I promise you, it's not surrounded by railing. You can physically come and touch those stones. Open Luke chapter 28. Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adored with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. pause here. That's exactly what I was telling you, right? Like the wow effect. People are coming here. Even the disciples are saying, hey, check this out. This is insane. Our mind is blown. But Jesus said, as for what you see here, the time will come when not a single stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. And this is like a point of agreement between Jews and Christians, right? Because this prophecy was fulfilled. The temple was destroyed roughly 40 years after Jesus walked on this earth. But to make things even more complicated, I would say the following thing, and I'm not trying to be offensive to anyone, I'm just trying to give you a full historical perspective. If the Wall Street Journal, or if the New York Times, or Fox News had and by the way, notice how I used all media outlets, right? Like on the right and the left, so everyone are happy. If they had a correspondent in Jerusalem, and he had to write like open ed or his political analysis of what's going on in Jerusalem, there is a good chance he would predict that the temple would be destroyed, because the Jewish world was divided into different sects, and those sects had a lot of hate running through them. And it's not far-fetched to assume that somewhere down the line, who knows when, a civil war would break out, and that's exactly what happened. We can call it a prophecy, we can call it a political forecast, depending where we stand from a spiritual perspective. And finally, I want to show you one more piece, and then I promise you I will open for questions because I see that there are some hands up. Sheila, I see your hand. Thank you for waiting so patiently. Oh, it's by accident. Okay, no worries. So I will open it up for questions in just a sec. But finally, I want to show you here my favorite artifact. And it's this stone that you see over here that the people are standing next to. All right. We know that this stone, based on the shape, fell up all the way from the top over here. If we go to Jewish sources, we know that in the southern west corner of the temple, every Friday, one of the members of the clergy will climb up there and will blow a shofar or a trumpet to announce that the day of the Sabbath is coming. Over here, I always ask people, who do you think did that? And typically you tell, oh, it must have been the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. And then I'll tell them, obviously, you did not serve in the army. Because over here, it's an ungrateful job. And who does the ungrateful job in a hierarchical society? The rookie, right? So this is probably like the rookie priest. You can even imagine the conversation. It's like, hey, you, get your butt over there. Come on, it's Sabbath, let's go. And he's like, oh, man, hate my life. And he climbs over there with the shofar and he blows it. And no one sees him. He's not getting any recognition all the way from the people standing down here, right? So he says, I want to be remembered. So what does he do? He did what I did when I was in the army. When I was in the army, when I was guarding in deserted places where I wanted to be recognized and remembered, I used to write my name, Asaf Boker in Hebrew, November 06 draft, oh, how much longer? This member of the clergy does the exact same thing on the corner. How do I know this is not perhaps Herod's intention? Take a look at the letters. Those letters look like childlike letters, right? Doesn't look like something that was planned all the way from the top. Notice how King Herod, right, he has every single stone fine cut around it. Therefore, this is ancient graffiti. And what does it say over here? Lebeit hatki'a leha, to the house of trumpeting to announce. Bear with me in order to fully understand what I just did. I came across a text that was written 2,000 years ago in Hebrew, the same language that Jesus spoke, and I'm convinced Jesus spoke Hebrew and not Aramaic, okay? He perhaps also spoke Aramaic, but the spoken language was Hebrew. And I read this text at the same ease as I read the newspaper every single morning. I don't know of another culture that can read a text that was written so long ago at the same ease as I just did now. Even the Chinese culture, which is very, very ancient, the symbols have a different meaning today. I was able to read it like this. And finally, I want to say over here, because this is really my favorite part, that I didn't just share with you history. Once the temple was destroyed, think about it logically. Who works in the temple? The priests, the clergy. When there is no more temple, Jews are entering the rabbinical era, right? When according to your wisdom, this is how you're going to get promoted. It's not about legacy. If you're a priest, almost no one cares. And the priests are like stripped away from their historical duties, except one thing, almost, to give the priestly blessing, the Birkat Kohanim, in the congregation. And they keep the last name, Cohen, Levi, Katz, and a lot of other Jewish last names. Now, I know that my grandfather, the Holocaust survivor that had passed away many years ago, he was a Cohen, because in his small community in Poland, he was able to give the priestly blessing to the congregation. And today, and that means I'm a Cohen as well. And today, with the breakthroughs in DNA, they were actually able to identify a specific gene called the Aaron gene, Aaron being the first priest, showing that Jews from different communities, and think about it, like Jews who live in Iraq and Jews who live in Poland for hundreds and thousands of years, if they have this gene, they have one common forefather, roughly 3,300 years ago, which guess what? Dates to the time of the Exodus. So this is, I think, pretty cool stuff. Pausing over here, and I want to take any quick questions we have. Members of the church, I know you have to go at 10:02, so any brief questions, now is the time, friends. Please feel free to unmute yourselves.
I thought there was a question in the chat about where is this wall with the heap of stones next to it?
So where is the wall? So this is the western wall. I'll do it like this. One sec. All right. So this is the wall we are talking about. All right. So this is the wall with the heap of stones. And if we go to the aerial photo over here, so you can see this is over here. You can recognize the Golden Dome. Where my mouse is now, this is where we were standing. So I hope this helps you to get some kind of geographical perspective.
So it's about like the Southern Excavation Park. Is that where?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I wasn't sure if everyone are familiar with the name. The name is the Davidson Center or the Southern Wall Excavations.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions so far? All right. You can marinate on them if they'll come up. All right. And we're going to go from here to our next site, which is also in the same complex. But this site is one of my favorite sites because I bring to this place a lot of groups, which are Jews and Christians. And I have here a script for each one of them. And you will have the privilege of hearing both. What are we now looking at? We're looking at the southern steps, which means every Jew who came to the temple. Here, Philip is showing us that he was here. So you can look at Philip's image as we're talking. Every Jew, right, that came into the temple walked up these steps to enter. You can see that over here we have the 3 exit gates, right? You can see them marked over here, 1, 2, and 3. They're blocked off today. And the entrance would have been over here. You can see the corner of the entrance, okay? Allow me to show you how this looked like 2,000 years ago. So 2,000 years ago, let's make sure that we're in the right place. Here we go, not from this angle. Let's look at it from this angle. All right, so these are the southern steps where we're now standing. You can see the 2 entrance gates, you can see the 3 exit gates. What do I tell every Jewish group who comes over here? You're Jewish. 2,000 years ago, there was a temple in Jerusalem. Jews were commanded to come to the temple 3 times a year. Not everyone did. Let's say your ancestors, no offense to anyone, were a little sloppy and they couldn't make it to come 3 times a year. They came once a year, for sure, once in their life. So you're now standing in the only place in Israel that you can be certain you're standing in the place your ancestors walked 2,000 years ago, because they had to walk through over here to the temple. If I guide Christian groups, I tell them something very, very similar. All over Israel, we have churches everywhere, right? And we always tell a story related to that church. But we have very few category A sites. Remember what category A sites are? Where scripture and archaeology are linked together. We don't have a lot of them. And this is probably the best one we have from a Christian perspective. When Jesus enters the temple, he steps over here. And therefore, for you as a Christian coming to the land of Israel, the only place I would argue you can be certain that you're standing in the place Jesus walked on is on those steps over here. And when Jews came here, they said the song of ascents. And I want to read to you Psalm 121 that I assume both the Christians here and the Jews are familiar with. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my aid come from? My aid comes from the Lord, the maker of the heavens and the earth. Take a look at how this short psalm actually makes your perfect geographical sense. You're looking at the hills around you. You're surrounded by hills. We just stood on this hill, the Mount of Olives, right? Where does my help come from? Maybe you walked here for a week, maybe for 2 weeks, maybe for 3 weeks, right? And then you arrive at the temple and you look at this magnificent building, and here comes your answer. My help comes from the Lord, the maker of the heavens and the earth. If you're ever invited to a Shabbat dinner in a Jewish family that observes singing the blessing over the food, on Friday night, they will sing that song. And this is the original geographical setting that this psalm was written in. Going back to our Christian perspective, and again, I know we're jumping back and forth. Jesus arrives in Jerusalem. And during his time in Jerusalem, I would call him as a political troublemaker. We've already talked about him talking about the destruction of the temple, right? This, in today's world, that could almost be considered as treason, saying that this temple will not be standing. He flips the tables of the money changers. Where do you think the clergy makes their money off, right? He is healing people on the day of the Sabbath. Now, is this illegal or not? That's a whole different Jewish law kind of discussion. And I remind you over here that the oral law at this point is oral. And therefore, there still isn't a fully agreed upon logic into what exactly the laws of Shabbat extend to. I remind you that the Jewish oral law would only be written down roughly 180 years after the time Jesus walks on this earth. And therefore, I would always argue, I say, look, Jesus was a Pharisee. As much as it's weird for us to think about it, but the umbrella of the definition of a Pharisee at this point was very, very, very wide. All the intellectual discussions that Jesus happens under the umbrella of Pharisee interpretation of Jewish law. Now, Jesus does all this, and then he goes and has his Last Supper. Now, you're probably, oh yeah, we heard there is a room in Mount Zion. This is the room of the Last Supper. We're going to be there next week, friends. It's not the room of the Last Supper, guaranteed. How do I know this? Because Jesus walked here 2,000 years ago, and the room itself is no older than 1,000 years. Right? So can we all agree that we don't know where the room of the Last Supper was? Okay, there are assumptions, we don't know. If we look at this map, our 3D model, let us go one sec to this. The traditional site of the room of Last Supper is where you see the nice red areas over here, right? The nice fancy buildings. I don't think this is the room of Last Supper anywhere over here, because Jesus his movement is a movement that focused on the lower end of the social ladder. Where does the lower end of the social ladder live? In these houses over here, in the lower city. So if I had to guess where the Last Supper would have taken place, it's over here in the lower city. Some people say it's by the sea and gates. Again, won't go into it now because we don't really know where that was. And I'll give you even another problem. We think that the lower city of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus is where the people who were not as wealthy lived, right? So Second Temple Jewish period, lower city, we would think the houses are not as nice. Well, news for everyone, news flash, bing, bing, bing. Archaeology, and we have found only well-off houses in Jerusalem, right? It's a little disappointing because you would think you have the higher city and then you have the lower city. The lower city is where the simple houses are. We almost found 0 simple houses in Jerusalem. Perhaps Jerusalem was so rich that anyone living inside the walls was well off and the poor ones lived outside. They left us less things to find archaeologically because they're poor. They have less ownership over physical goods. Maybe that's why we didn't find it. But after the Last Supper, Jesus goes to pray in a site called Gethsemane. All right. Ready for your Hebrew lesson, friends? Hebrew lesson. All right. This one I'm skipping. Gethsemane is a category A site. All right. Gethsemane is made up of two Hebrew words. Gat Shmanim, an olive grove. How do we know it's a category A site? Because the name has been preserved specifically here. And I know it's loading. Give it one more sec, and we'll be hopeful. Here we go. So the name has been preserved. And therefore, we know that Jesus comes here to pray on his last night. He sits down, he has his Passover Seder that probably did not look like the Passover Seder we celebrate today, was perhaps the very early stages of what a Passover Seder would come. And then he arrives at Gethsemane, called in Hebrew Gat Shmanim, an olive grove. Now, when I bring here Christian groups, I stop before I talk about the physical site. And I ask them the following question. Jesus is a Jew, right? And everyone nods in agreement. Jews are monotheistic, right? And everyone nods in agreement with that as well, which means we believe that God is present everywhere. And therefore, there is no meaning if you pray in the room of the Last Supper, or if you go outside of the city to where the olives are grown. By the way, the olives are needed for one of the temple rituals, of course, to light the menorah made from lit with olive oil. But why does he need to go to Gethsemane? He could simply pray in the room of the Last Supper itself, or maybe go up to the roof if he wants to find himself more of a quiet environment. I don't have an answer. I think this is for sure a mystery worth thinking about, but I think I have an assumption. Where was Jesus from originally? Where was he raised? Nazareth. Nazareth is a small rural community, surrounded, by the way, by olive trees, up until this day. Jesus knows this is his last night on this planet, on this earth, before he reunites with his Father. And I think that the answer is sentimental. He wants to remind himself of the views that he had of Nazareth as he was growing up. And Jerusalem is a hustling, bustling city. In Passover, the population explodes from 100,000 people to 300,000 people. Like everywhere you go, it's people. He knows it's his last night, so he's coming here to Gethsemane to pray. And over here, I always tell people this, that his prayer on this night is a Jewish ritual, right? If you open the Haggadah, the Jewish codex we read in Passover, it is said that rabbis yoshvim b'Bnei Brak, that are sitting in Bnei Brak, and the custom was to sit down and pray and tell the story of the Exodus all night, and the more, the merrier. Jesus is coming here and he's praying all night. And by the way, two of his disciples are failing and they're falling asleep. Something, by the way, which is not uncommon in the Jewish Seder today. Like if you really keep everything and you drink the amount of wine you're supposed to drink, good chance you will fall asleep in the process, right? So they're failing and staying up. But him staying up all night, praying to his Father, this is an early Passover tradition. And this is, I think, a dot worth creating. Now, there are several things here, and again, I can't touch everything I was intending because I do notice the clock. But in Christian teachings, we see that in this night, Jesus shows his human nature, asking his Father, Father, pass this cup from me. And I think the choosing of Gethsemane for this site also has another symbolism to how olive oil is produced. How do you produce olive oil? You take the olive and you press it and you press it and you press it until the oil comes out. And one would argue, this is not my interpretation, I've heard it from a pastor I very much appreciate and adore, and he says this is exactly what he's going through. He's being pressured and pressured and pressured on this night until he shows his true nature. Now, his human nature, sorry, not his true nature. As you're looking at these olive trees, you're probably wondering, wait, like we're here and you're bringing us here and you're saying this is a category A site. So are these the trees that stood here at the time of Jesus as he prayed in Gethsemane? And first of all, I want to say something about category A. I don't know where Jesus prayed specifically in Gethsemane, right? No one can know that. Now, it's a very Catholic thing to create holy relics. So when you see this church, the Church of All Nations in Gethsemane, over there they have the stone of agony where, according to Catholic belief, Jesus prayed. I don't know if that's there, and neither do you. No one does. It's a tradition. It's the power of tradition. But somewhere in this garden, maybe across the road, he did pray. He did not see those trees because these trees, as ancient as they look, they're roughly 700 years old. But there is something remarkable about olive trees, and that new trees or newer trees can grow from a more ancient root system. And when we tested the roots of those trees in carbon-14 dating, we have found that the roots of the original trees that were here date to 2100 to 1900 years ago. Sorry, not ago, not BC, ago, which mean that the roots of those trees, the original trees, were planted here somewhere around the time of Jesus. Which, again, remember the size of the temple? It shouldn't come as a surprise to us. With such a big temple, obviously you need a lot of oil to light the menorah. Those trees are nearby, and therefore it's very useful in that hand. Pausing over here, any questions so far? I take the silence as a good sign. I hope I should. All right, so we're going to go ahead to our next site. And I think we have just the right amount of time for it. We're now heading to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Right, and sorry, friends, that as this is loading up, sometimes when I leave this for too long, it does take a while to reload again, but no worries. So we're going to start off here. Church of the Holy Sepulchre, this is what people expect to find here, right? Like, you've studied your Bible, and you know that Jesus was crucified on a hill. By the way, nowhere in the Bible it says he was crucified on a hill. We expect it to be outside the walls of Jerusalem, because you know the Jews will not crucify or Jews don't crucify, but they will not bury anyone within the boundaries of the city because of laws of impurity, right? And we expect to find a burial cave because Jews at this time were buried in caves. And when people come to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for the first time, and they're seeing this massive, massive complex, most times I get a feeling of disappointment, right? Like, that can't be here. And I get this, by the way, from no matter what denomination. Everyone like that can be right, especially if they never thought about it. But in fact, when we look at the archaeological setting and the geological setting of the church, we actually say maybe that could be here. Why? Because we have found here the remnants of a burial cave. But the burial cave has collapsed over the year, right? Because you're putting such a big structure on top of it. No wonder it will collapse as time goes by. We found here what seems to be somewhat of a hill that could have been used as a site of a crucifixion. And most importantly, we have found here, and I'm just trying to rush us through to this picture. One sec, not this one. We have found here something that could indicate the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the correct site. So where do we put the Church of the Holy Sepulchre now? Remember our A, B, and C category? I put it as a category B, and then I add, this is the best category B we have. Let's talk for a second about the Jewish world and the Christian world, all right? In the Roman world, Judaism was a very, very interesting religion. People appreciated the monotheism, and people admired to believe in one God. But Judaism was a very demanding religion. And therefore, a lot of Romans said, you know what, it's cool, but no, we're not going to cross that line. What was that line mainly? Circumcision. This is something that grown-ups, adults were not willing to go through. Now, when you think about it, once Sorry, I have to narrow down my guiding, so I have to rethink how I'm going to phrase this. Okay. Now, Judaism was appealing, but it didn't really pose a threat on the Romans. Why? Because it was a religion based on law, circumcision, other laws. There's no fear that the masses would all of a sudden become Jewish, right? It's just not going to happen. But when Christianity separates from Judaism, I would say it happens in the book of Acts, right? When Paul creates his version of Judaism, which becomes Christianity, this new religion poses a threat on the Romans. Because in Rome, there is no separation of religion and state. If you belong to the new religion, are you really a Roman citizen? In Rome, roughly 25% of the revenue came from pagan temples. If everyone are going to become Christian, no one will go to the pagan temples. This is a serious threat. So the Romans restricted any type of Christian worship. Judaism had a legal status, but Christianity did not. It was forbidden. Now, when you look at this, this was found in one of the foundations of the building of the church. Before there was a church here, before the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was constructed, on the foundations here, we have had a pagan Roman temple. This was left over here. And it says here in Latin, Lord, we have come, which is also reference to the, here, I'm forgetting my English here again, to one of the verses of Psalms. But what this is, most likely because of the primitive text, the childlike letters, and the dating which dates it to the second century around the year 180, Christianity is forbidden. That shows us that in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, before it was built, when it was serving as a Roman pagan temple, someone came over here from afar. That's why they drew the ship. And they drew this graffiti and said, Lord, we have come. This is a sign of Christian worship at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, even before the church was built. Now, this is something that you don't see in tours. You don't see in tours because this graffiti is not accessible. It's in a part of the church which belongs to the Armenian church, which brings me to the point of, let's for a second talk about the church itself. Because the church itself, when you look at it, it's made up of a lot of different parts, and the architectural style is very, very different from one part to another. And this church is the only church in the world which is controlled not by one Christian denomination, but by 6 separate Christian denominations. And I'll name them just so we get the order right. It belongs to the Greek Orthodox, to the Catholics, to the Armenians, to the Coptics, to the Assyrians, and to the Ethiopians. And they're all sharing the sacred space together. Now, I know that over here we have a church with us, and I know this church does not belong to any of these denominations. So you're probably all thinking, what about us? Like, what about the Protestants and all the Protestant breakdowns of denominations? Why don't they get a part in the church? Answer is this. This church you're looking at is one of the 5 most ancient churches in the world. It was built here in the year 335. In the year 335, Martin Luther did not put his thesis on the Church of Wittenberg yet. There is no Protestant, and therefore in the 16th century, where Protestantism becomes a separate denomination of Christianity, we will later on break onto another million denominations. When they're coming into the church, they don't have a single place to represent them because the church is already all divided up. And that's why there's an alternative site of worship called the Garden Tomb. Maybe I'll steal a few minutes of our time next session and I'll talk more about it. But finally, I'll say here, do all Christian denominations live here happily ever after? And the answer is, I wish I could tell you yes. And the answer is yes and no. For the most part, 365 days a year, this church conducts itself in perfect harmony. That's not something to take lightly. Because if you choose to devote and to live here in this church, that means you're not Christian-ish. You're Christian, right? This matters. This is the essence of your life. And for people who are so devout to their religion, to be able to share the sacred space, that's something truly inspiring. But there are cases where that's not the case. In the 19th century, the church was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire by nature. And the Muslim empire decided to lock up the church for new worshippers to come in or to visit. As a result of that, the entire complex was locked down. And the Armenians, who have the living quarters over here, decided they're not going to leave the church. Or in other words, they are locked in. Now, how are they going to get food while they're locked in? And we're talking about 150 years ago. They placed a ladder on their balcony, and every day they climbed down from the ladder, threw a rope down with a bucket, and got their food this way. They did this for 7 years. 7 years after, new policy. Church now is open, things are back to normal. Now, the problem is that the balcony here does not belong to the Armenians. The balcony belongs to the Greek Orthodox. So the Greek Orthodox are coming to the living quarters of the Armenians. They're knocking on the door. The Armenians are opening the door and they're drinking Armenian coffee. And they're telling, hey guys, like this ladder thing has to go. And the Armenians look them straight in the eye. And they say, look guys, ladder stays. And the Greek Orthodox are like jumping up of their seats and they're about to start a fist fight right there. What are you talking about? This has been our balcony for hundreds of years, blah. The Armenians were like, look guys, relax. No question that the balcony is yours, but the ladder is ours. And the ladder has been there for 7 years. As a result of that, this is the new deal. Ladder stays, balcony is yours, ladder stays on your balcony. Now, I know it's hard for you to wrap your heads around it, but this ladder is called the status quo ladder, and it has been here for over 150 years. In many ways, it symbolizes the balance and the boundaries of how this church is conducted. Now, final words here, and then we will conclude because I know you all have to go to services. So I missed out on a lot of places in the church because we don't really know if that happened there or not. And I want to take you to the tomb itself. And if we read chapter 28, I want to point out something super, super interesting. Chapter 28 of the book of Matthew. After the Shabbat at dawn, the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the others went in to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down of the heaven and was going down to the tomb, rolled back the stone, and sat on it. Later on, asked Rabbi, later on asked her pastor, in how many cases in the Bible can you remember or find an angel which is sitting down? All right, this is where they discovered that the body of Jesus is not there. But why is the angel sitting down? Because in the setting of a Jewish tomb, and we have a tomb like this in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's made up of a room and then 2 niches. In the niches, you store the bones, and the room is typically so low that you can't stand up. You can only see it as you're kneeling down. Why is the angel kneeling down? Because you can't stand up. It's part of the geographical reality. And the reason I talk about it over here is, look, everyone comes and worships at this tomb over here, right? This is the tomb. It's called the Edikol, but you don't really get a feeling of a tomb over here because this is a modern day building. It was built 500 years ago over the tomb itself. But if you look behind this door over here in this entrance, this is a real tomb from the time of Jesus, from the Second Temple era. And when you look over here, you will see that you can't stand up. And that's why the angel is sitting down. And over there, Jews were buried. First of all, you leave the body for a year, and then a year later, you come to collect the bones. Why are the women coming to check the tomb after 3 days? Very simple. Back then, there is no CPR. There is no graph that shows you heartbeat. It is not uncommon that people were buried and were still alive. Therefore, you're coming and you're checking in on that person for day 1, day 2, and day 3, you never come, because typically if you're dead day 1 and 2, no one comes in day 3. The reason in Gospels we see that it happened in day 3 is to remove any possible doubt that this is in fact a miracle. And the angel is there waiting down because of the geographical reality. I've went over time of what I intended, and I know you have to go to services. So I will stay here for any questions that anyone has, but I want to say really thank you for joining me in exploring Jerusalem. And I will put the link to my TripAdvisor page on this page. If you've enjoyed our session so far, and if you just want to do something nice, want to say thank you, I would really, really, really appreciate if you just open the chat and write a review on my TripAdvisor page. This would really, really mean a great deal to me. And open up now for any questions. I know we've rushed through, but again, we did 3 days in 1 hour.
And for those of you that need to leave, don't forget that next week we have our another tour. So come and join us at 9 a.m. We'd love to have you. Don't forget to go to the TripAdvisor page for Asaf. And I think, Asaf, what we learned this morning is we just all physically have to come and spend days with you in Jerusalem. So that's got to be our goal. Any questions for Asaf before we conclude?
So Tina asked me how many A sites are there in Israel? And the answer is it's hard to tell because the categories like A, B, and C are not professional archaeological categories. It's what we use as tour guides. I would say that category A sites, and again, it depends how wide or narrow your definition is, no more than 10. No more than 10 tops.
Asaf, without getting too much into the politics and making this too long of an answer, does Israel watch over all these sites to allow people to visit, and are they under Israel's control, or how does that work for the Christian sites?
So first of all, yes. And I think that Israel practices a very high degree of maintaining the holy sites. By the way, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish will be open to the public. Of course, no state does a perfect job, but I think that this does represent Israel's policies. The churches themselves are partially self-governed, mainly by the Franciscan, with their Catholic sites, by the Greek Orthodox Patriarchy, with their Greek Orthodox sites. The fun fact is that 93% of all the land in Israel is state-owned land, and the largest private landowner in Israel is the Greek Orthodox Patriarchy. And actually, Rehavia, Jerusalem, which is like, I would say the most well-off, pretty neighborhood in Jerusalem, fair parts of it were leased to the Zionist organizations before the state of Israel was founded. And it was a 100-year lease, which is ending in the next couple of years. Will be very interesting where all the rich and famous Israelis live. How will they try and renew the lease? It was originally signed with the Greek Orthodox Patriarchy. But generally, you can all sites from the standpoint of the state of Israel are open to anyone. A lot of churches choose to restrict the hours, the numbers of visitors, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you so much. All right, friends, I think for the sake of all that is going on this morning, both for the church and our synagogue as we have our annual meeting, we're going to stop there. Asaf, thank you as always. Amazing. Learned so much this morning and can't wait to see you next week. Have a wonderful week. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your Sunday. Look forward to seeing you.